Contemporary Context, Part 2, Fashion Textiles. I started this course by looking at the Guardian Best Pictures of the Day, and from these I created a trend book. There are two different types of trends really going on here. It's all the theme of protection, but the first 6 pictures all relate to the coronavirus, and the bottom 2 pictures relate to physical protection. So my trend book was looking at the theme of protection, that's physically and spiritually, and also the healing power of touch. During coronavirus, we were unable to touch our loved ones and how everybody missed that, and also it wasn't safe to touch each other, so looking at that from 2 different angles. From these images I extracted a colour palette, and this is the colour palette. So we have silver, pink, yellow, blue, orange, turquoise, red and a berry red. My chosen technique for this project was weaving, and so I made these yarn windings using different textures, and initially I just made some little windings on these popsicle sticks to use really as colour inspiration as I worked. In the research I did before making, I looked at 2 companies who use weaving, and these are from John Boyd Textiles. These samples are really beautiful. They're very shimmery. I don't know if you can quite tell, but they're made from horsehair weft. So for example, this one has a silk warp and is much finer and sheerer, and then on this one is also a silk warp, and this one is cotton, so it's extremely strong fabric. But what I like most about these textiles is the fact that they are so shimmery, they hold the light, and that's something I want to incorporate with my own woven samples. Another company that I looked at that makes woven cloth is Linton Tweeds. Linton Tweeds fabric is absolutely incredible. It's used in couture. People can buy it from the shop and make their own clothes with it. But this is a reinvention of tweed from what we think of the very old-fashioned heritage tweed, and it's now made in the most amazing colours and amazing textures. So I've chosen samples that actually work with my own samples. So I have here the red, which goes with the red, and the pink. This pink is beautiful. It's a boucle tweed, and it was originally used by Linton Tweeds to make the iconic Chanel cardigan. This is silver, and the yellow is very glitzy, lots of gold in that. The blue is very fine, so it has a transparency, which is something else I want to incorporate into my woven textiles, and that is really because of the plastic screens that were covering people in the pictures from the coronavirus. This also is quite sheer, very glamorous, with lots of glittery colours in it, and this blue is stunning. It goes with my scheme very well. So when I come to making my own textiles, I'm using this as inspiration, and I'm not actually going to make tweed. I'm going to use more like these John Boyd Textiles. I'm going to use the warp as the pattern for my own textiles. So having decided on my product and how I wanted to look, I started off by doing some quick digital art shots using the colours, and you can see I've sort of taken the yellow and blue stripes there in that one, and from this red in the red drawing there. I then experimented a little bit by using watercolours to try and get some textures in. And then going further on textures, I used frottage. So these are rubbings from all different places around the home, but just to try and create some great textures, and you can actually feel them when you rub your hands over them. I then experimented with collage. This is to get some ideas of simple jacket shapes for my chosen product, and to again incorporate some colour, some pattern and some texture. When you feel there's some beautiful textures in that is some handmade paper. And these are more, so we have a little spark going on in there, and introducing some shapes here. That one also has some lovely textures in it. Another experiment I did with textures was by using things from the food cupboard. So this is salt and acrylic paint. This is rice. This one is oats, and that one is sugar. So they all make fantastic textures, particularly the oats. That one took the paint really, really well. So now I've got all my ideas for colour, shape and textures, I started to make some mini samples, one for each colour. So I have pink, and that is really looking more at the like the Chanel type cardigan jacket. So very couture, very glamorous, but very understated. And then we have the yellow, which is very shimmery. Yellow is really, really hard. This is t-shirt fabric cut up, but the different yellows, they can sort of muddy each other and change colour, so it's actually quite tricky to get yellows together. The blue, again, like the pink, is quite classy. It's very simple, but it has some silk in here. It has some sparkly glitter. This is probably my favourite. There's so many textures in this. Silver, lots of metallics, lots of boucle type wool. There's mohair in there. Very, very shimmery, very glamorous, that one. And then for the next four, we have turquoise, and this has some unusual yarns in there, but also this lovely fluffy, two fluffy ones there, which really, really tactile, very warm to touch. The orange is very, very bright, and it has lots of tiny details in this. There's some satin, there's some silk, there's raffia in there, there's a stringy wool, and there's a silk wool. So again, lots of textures in that one. This one was based on the flamenco picture of the flamenco dancer dancing behind plastic, but it captured the light and the whole feeling of flamenco, the passion, the redness, the richness. And finally, the berry has lots of different textured wool here, so this is very fluffy. There's some faux fur in there, and there's also lots of sparkles in there as well. So having made these small samples, I now wanted to upscale them to give more of an idea of how the jacket product would look, and I've incorporated more into these samples. So there's some quite fancy wool there with different shades of red. There's velvet, there's this lovely tinsel wool, there's some silk. The interesting thing about doing this was the red and berries, mixing them together. Like the yellows, it's quite hard because sometimes the red next to a darker red can turn one more orangey or pinky or more purple. So it was actually quite hard to mix the colours for that sample. I absolutely love this sample. This is the grey and silver as a match, and we have this faux fur. There's again some very, very subtle little things in here. There's a very pale silk, there's a very strong metallic, a mix of deep grey and pink there, and this lovely fluffy fabric at the bottom and some velvet. So it's very, very luxurious, that one. In comparison, the blue and the yellow is very fresh, very spring-like, and the two colours mix well together. It was quite hard to get the tension right on this because I used the cut-up t-shirt, which was stretchy, and then mixing it in with things like mohair and this very sort of fleecy wool. It was quite hard to get the tension right on that sample, but I think it works really, really well. I do absolutely love this. It's my favourite colours, and it has a very sort of slightly boho feel to it. Technically, this is the best sample because the different yarns that I used, they all had the same kind of tension, and it worked really well together. There's some slightly different things in here. I've got some raffia, some silk, there's string, there's mohair, there's very fluffy wool, very thick chunky wool, fine wool, and again very, very textural. So having made these samples, I wanted to think about how they would look on the figure. So I used digital art to then put these fabrics onto Fashion Designs to give a better idea of how these would look on the body. And although that worked really well, I thought, what would they look like on a real person? So without having a model, I just sort of photoshopped them onto myself, and it did give quite an idea of what those samples would look like as a jacket product and worn on a real person. My next thought was I needed to make a larger sample, but to just pick 2 out of the 4. So I did a survey on Instagram and on Facebook, and all of these 4 samples were equally loved, but slightly picked to the post were 2, with the pink and silver and the red and berry. So I started off by using a scarf loom to make a sort of a scarf type sample, which actually is quite useful in seeing how it would look as a sleeve. It gives you a bit of an idea how it looks as a sleeve worn on the jacket, or even worn that way around, so you'd have the fur at the bottom there. Again, it shows the textures, and I made sure to incorporate the tinsel wool and this very fluffy wool, because in the feedback I had, those yarns were the ones that stood out that people seemed to like in the design. And the same with the pink one, they felt that the fluffy looked really nice at the bottom, and the silver. The interesting thing about this is, on my theme of protection, thinking about protecting people like during the coronavirus, I used strips cut up from an emergency blanket, which is used to put around people when they're been traumatized or during first aid. So it seemed to sort of fit the idea of protection. And so finally I went to a larger loom and I made a much larger piece. So sort of try and give an idea of scale here. And it's much easier now to see a pattern. I use the Saori weaving technique, which is basically not to have a pattern, but just to work as you go along with materials that you have. So this is all about the weft, so you can see all the different fabrics used for the weft. And I tried to mix in the berry with the brighter red as I worked along. And I did the same with the pink and silver. This one is still off the loom because I really wanted to show sort of what the weft looked like. It still has this very glamorous look to it. Some really, really lovely textures, and ending with the fluffy wool at the bottom, which is what everybody seemed to like. by leaving these ends you can see some of the fabric. So we have some metallics here, we have the emergency blanket, there's some dip dyed sari silks, just ordinary wool, and this lovely faux fur, and there's some fleece wool there, and there's also some organza because I wanted to capture light and the sheerness of the fabric. And from the size of these pieces you can then actually see what they would look like worn as a jacket. So if that was the jacket part and if this was the sleeve, it sort of gives an idea of how this would look as a jacket, as my final product. And I pinned them onto me and took some photos to give an idea of what the jacket would look like as a final piece. So that is the journey from start to finish, from using the Guardian Best Pictures of the Day, extracting a theme, protect, and then taking colours from that, using the colours in my woven techniques, and finally creating these two jackets as my final product. Although there's still lots of room to explore, and I would quite like to explore this even further. Thank you.